In the grey industrial heart of Manchester, 1854, Edith Winthrop came into the world screaming, not out of fear but defiance, as the midwife later told her mother. Even as a child, Edith's voice was her power. She spoke early, asked questions others avoided, and saw truth where adults preferred silence. Her father, Charles Winthrop, was a respected textile merchant. Wealthy, stern, and proud of his reputation, he believed that discipline, obedience, and silence were the virtues of a good household. Her mother, Margaret, frail and timid, obeyed him as though it was second nature. To her, peace meant quiet, and quiet meant survival. But Edith was different. By the age of 12, she was sneaking into her father's study to read newspapers about the world. Articles about suffragists, workers' rights, and political debates that women were never meant to hear. When her father caught her once, he tore the paper from her hands and said coldly, "A woman who reads will never find peace." She looked him straight in the eye and replied, "Then peace must not be worth much." That single sentence earned her a week confined to her room and a reputation as the difficult one. Yet even punishment could not tame her mind. She listened to the workers in the mills, their coughs from the lint-filled air, the children her age hunched over looms. She asked her father why they were treated so poorly. "Because that is their station," he snapped. "And what if they wish to rise above it?" she pressed. "Then they must know their place first," he warned. But Edith never accepted her place. By 16, she began to attend secret reading circles, groups of women who met in candle-lit rooms to share banned essays and books written by female authors. She was fascinated by the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who dared to suggest that women could think, lead, and even change the world. Those meetings filled her with both hope and danger. In Victorian England, a woman with an opinion was often branded unstable. A woman who refused marriage or obedience was hysterical. Edith understood the risk, but her sense of justice burned too fiercely to be hidden. When her father arranged for her to marry Edward Halbridge, a 35-year-old business associate twice her age, Edith refused. She stood before her family at the dinner table and declared, "I will not marry a man who looks at me as property. I would rather die my own woman than live as someone's shadow." Her father's face turned crimson. The utensils dropped. Silence fell heavy as thunder. No one had ever spoken to Charles Winthrop that way, not even his sons. That night, the shouting could be heard across the estate. Servants whispered as the argument tore through the halls. Her mother wept quietly while Edith stood her ground. "You will ruin this family," her father said. "You speak like a madwoman." And then, with cold precision, he added, "If you cannot be controlled in this house, perhaps someone else will manage it for me." For the next few weeks, Edith was kept indoors, isolated from her friends, forbidden to write or read. But she managed to hide a notebook beneath the floorboards of her room. There she wrote her thoughts, her dreams, her anger, her determination. In one of her final entries before everything changed, she wrote, "If they fear my words, then my words must have power. And if my voice is a sin, then I am glad to be a sinner." In early 1875, the Winthrop family hosted a grand church dinner. Local dignitaries, businessmen, and the family's allies attended. Among them Dr. Lawrence Halbridge, Edward's cousin, and a well-known physician. During the meal, conversation turned to the subject of female hysteria, a fashionable medical topic of the time. Halbridge spoke pompously about how women's emotions made them unfit for education or political matters. "The female mind," he said with authority, "is delicate, easily disturbed by overexcitement or opinion." The guests chuckled. Her father smiled approvingly. But Edith, seated quietly at the end of the table, could no longer hold her tongue. "Then perhaps it is not the female mind that is fragile," she said calmly, "but the male ego that fears it." The laughter stopped. Forks froze midair. Dr. Halbridge's face darkened. Her father's hand slammed against the table. "That is enough," he barked. "You disgrace this family." Edith stood, trembling yet unbroken. "If truth disgraces you, then it's your own reflection you despise." Her words burned through the room like fire through silk. That night sealed her fate. The following morning, Halbridge visited her father privately. He spoke in low tones about treatment, recovery, and saving the family's name. He wrote a report, a single sheet of paper declaring Edith Winthrop mentally unstable due to emotional hysteria, delusional stubbornness, and excessive intellectual ambition. 3 signatures, her father's, Dr. Halbridge's, and the parish vicar's, were all it took. At dawn, 2 men arrived with a carriage from Ravenscroft Asylum for the mentally frail. Edith's mother pleaded quietly for mercy, but her father turned his back. When they came to take her, Edith didn't scream. She simply looked at her father with tearless eyes and said, "You can silence me, but you'll never own me." Those were her last words before she was forced into the carriage. Her wrists bound, her books confiscated, her name erased from family records. As the wheels rolled away on the cobbled road, the morning sun cut through the fog like judgment itself. She didn't cry. She only whispered to herself, "Let them call me mad." The truth often sounds like madness to those who fear it. And thus began the legend of the woman who would one day burn the silence that tried to bury her. Edith Winthrop, the girl who spoke too much. The carriage that carried Edith Winthrop to Ravenscroft Asylum for the mentally frail rattled across the frozen countryside like a hearse. She watched through the barred window as the world she knew slipped away. The streets of Manchester, the smoke rising from the mills, the fleeting freedom of the open sky. By the time the carriage stopped before the asylum gates, morning light had turned grey. Ravenscroft stood like a fortress of despair. Red, bricked walls streaked with soot, narrow windows like unblinking eyes, and a heavy oak door that closed behind her with the sound of a verdict. A matron with a face like carved stone took her papers without meeting her gaze. Name, Edith Winthrop. The matron scanned the document. 21 years old. Hysteria, delusional tendencies, oppositional behavior. Her lips curled slightly. "We'll see if silence will cure you." Inside, Ravenscroft smelled of carbolic acid, rot, and sorrow. The halls were lined with peeling paint and echoes of distant cries. Women in grey gowns shuffled past with empty eyes, their hair cropped short, their hands trembling. In her first hour, Edith understood one thing. This was not a place for healing. It was a graveyard for the living. Her first night was sleepless. The walls groaned with every gust of wind, and somewhere down the corridor, a woman screamed until her voice broke. At dawn, the bell rang. They were herded into a stone hall for treatment, a ritual of humiliation disguised as medicine. Dr. Lawrence Halbridge, the asylum's chief physician, cousin to the man Edith had refused to marry, presided over the ward. His presence alone was suffocating. A tall man with a calm, deliberate voice, he spoke as if God himself had handed him authority over broken souls. "Discipline," he said to the assembled women, "is the first step to recovery. Your minds are sick because they resist order. Here we cure resistance." The cure involved cold baths, restraint chairs, and endless silence. The patients were forbidden to speak unless spoken to, and even then, only to answer yes or no. Edith learned quickly that defiance brought punishment. Solitary confinement in the white room, where the walls pressed close and the light never dimmed. Within weeks, she saw how the asylum operated like a cruel machine. Dr. Halbridge, who took pleasure in testing new therapies on helpless women. Mr. Fenton, the warden, who sold the patients letters and personal items for profit. Reverend Cole, a visiting chaplain, who claimed to clean sin through private sessions that left his victims sobbing. Everywhere she turned, there was cruelty dressed as care. Ravenscroft was not a hospital. It was a prison built on the screams of women whose only crime was speaking. In her second month, Edith tried to resist. She argued when they forced laudanum down her throat. She shouted when a patient named Mary was beaten for refusing to kneel in prayer. But her defiance only earned her a punishment meant to crush her completely. One cold morning, she was taken to the hydrotherapy room, stripped to her slip, and locked in a bath of ice water. "It will calm your nerves," said the matron, tightening the straps that held her arms. The water was so cold it felt like knives cutting her skin. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth. When she emerged, shaking and weak, she realized that her words, her greatest weapon, had become her enemy here. Speaking only made her a target. The next time Dr. Halbridge questioned her, she said nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And Edith Winthrop, the fiery girl who once debated politics and defied her father, fell silent. But her silence was not surrender, it was survival. Among the staff, she became known as the Silent One. She didn't scream during punishments. She didn't speak to guards. She watched. She listened. She learned the routines. When the guards changed shifts, when the nurses refilled the lamps, when the storerooms were left unlatched. She memorized the paths of rats that scurried through cracks in the walls, the way the building creaked before storms. In silence, she found clarity. She began to communicate through small gestures, a look, a touch, a shared glance between women who had lost everything but their will. Slowly, she built a fragile web of trust among the patients. There was Anna, who hummed lullabies in her sleep, and Clara, a young nurse new to the asylum, whose compassion had not yet been crushed. Edith would help the others eat, whispering instructions when guards weren't looking. "Hide your pain," she would murmur. "They feed on it." The silence that once suffocated her became her armor, a way to move unseen, to think while others wept. One evening, while cleaning the corridor outside Dr. Halbridge's office, Edith overheard a conversation that froze her blood. The doctor was speaking with Mr. Fenton. "The report will list them as deceased from fever," Halbridge said casually. "No one questions the numbers. Their families rarely visit anyway. And the belongings, burned or sold. The dead don't need jewelry." Edith realized the truth. The asylum wasn't just cruel, it was corrupt. Patients were dying and their deaths were being covered up. Ravenscroft was feeding itself on the lives of women society had discarded. That night, Edith lay awake, her mind burning with thoughts she dared not speak. Every cry, every punishment, every unjust death carved a mark inside her. She felt the anger of every silenced woman echo within those walls. Ravenscroft had taken her voice, but in return it had given her purpose. By the time winter returned in 1876, Edith had transformed completely. Her silence had become legendary among the staff, a sign, they thought, of submission. But it was something far more dangerous, discipline born of fury. She began to plan. In her long, sleepless nights, she studied the cracks in the building, the smell of oil in the air, the placement of every lantern. She noted when the guards drank, when Reverend Cole's prayers ended, when Dr. Halbridge locked his office. The asylum that had once imprisoned her had now become a map she could read by heart, and every echo that rang through its halls, every cry, every sob, every whispered prayer, strengthened her resolve. Ravenscroft thought it had broken her, but in truth, it had built her into something else entirely, a woman who could endure, observe, and one day act. The walls of Ravenscroft echoed with the voices of the forgotten, and among them, Edith Winthrop learned the language of silence. She no longer needed to shout to be heard. Her silence was a promise that one day those who silenced her would hear her voice. In fire and injustice, and in the ruin of the walls that had once caged her. By the spring of 1877, Edith Winthrop had become a shadow within Ravenscroft Asylum, neither alive nor dead, neither free nor completely broken. Her silence, once born of punishment, had evolved into something far more dangerous: control. To the doctors, she was cured of hysteria. To the attendants, she was harmless, a quiet girl who obeyed every order, folded her blanket neatly, and never caused trouble. But to the few women who still retained a fragment of sanity, she was something else entirely. She was the watcher. Every morning began with the same cold ritual: the bell at 6, the line up in the corridor, inspection by the matron, a squat, sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Briggs, whose eyes missed nothing but compassion. Then breakfast, thin porridge ladled into tin bowls, eaten under the gaze of guards. Talking was forbidden, laughter was punished, even crying was discouraged, for tears were considered a sign of relapse. But in that heavy silence, Edith had learned a new language, one of looks, gestures, and small acts of rebellion. A flicker of the eyes meant, "Be careful." A tap on the table meant, "Hide it." A hand brushed over the heart meant, "You are not alone." It wasn't speech as the world knew it, but within the gray walls of Ravenscroft, it was the only way truth survived. Edith's silence sharpened her mind like a blade. Without the distraction of words, she noticed everything: the squeak of hinges when guards entered the medicine room, the soft clink of keys in the matron's apron, the way Dr. Halbridge's expression changed when he lied to his superiors. She knew which floors creaked, which staircases were watched, which rooms were left unlocked. She counted footsteps in the hall to measure the guards' routines. Her silence was not emptiness, it was calculation. To the others, she seemed detached, lost in her own world. But she was always listening. Every moan, every cry, every whispered prayer from the other women became a piece of the asylum's living map. She could tell who was being punished by the rhythm of the screams, who had died by the sudden hush that followed. Silence had once been forced upon her. Now it was her weapon. One person noticed the spark beneath Edith's quiet. A young nurse named Clara Milton, barely 19, with trembling hands and soft eyes. She was new to Ravenscroft, too kind for such a place. The other nurses mocked her for her pity, but Clara persisted in treating the women with gentleness, sneaking them bits of bread or whispering hymns when no one listened. Clara often lingered by Edith's cell, curious about the silent girl who seemed untouched by madness. One afternoon, she left a folded scrap of paper under Edith's tin cup. It read, "I believe you're not sick. I believe they fear you. If you ever need my help, nod twice tomorrow at breakfast." The next morning, Edith nodded. That small exchange began a fragile alliance. Clara became Edith's unseen ally, slipping her bits of information, extra matches from the kitchen, and even access to the storeroom when she was on duty. Through Clara, Edith learned of the asylum's corruption, of funds stolen, patients' belongings sold, and women dying from accidents that were anything but. Each revelation fed the fire in Edith's heart. Yet she spoke no word of anger. Not yet. One rain-soaked evening, Edith was ordered to assist in the infirmary, where a patient named Helena, a frail widow committed for melancholia, lay dying. Dr. Halbridge stood over her, giving orders to the attendants. "Record it as natural," he said. "No need for the family to be troubled." Eleanor's eyes met Edith's. They were clouded, but still human. She whispered faintly, "Please don't let me disappear." Something in Edith snapped, not into chaos, but into clarity. She realized that Ravenscroft wasn't merely a prison. It was a machine designed to erase lives, one silent death at a time. And no one outside would ever know. That night, she stared at the ceiling of her cell, listening to the dripping pipes. Her heart was steady, not frantic. She had reached a decision. If silence was survival, then noise would be her freedom. In the weeks that followed, Edith convinced Clara to smuggle in paper and a pencil stub. Together, under the dim light of the supply room, Edith wrote her first words in nearly 2 years, a letter addressed to anyone who might read it beyond the asylum walls. "My name is Edith Winthrop. I was placed here against my will for speaking against injustice. Ravenscroft Asylum is not a hospital, but a tomb for women who dare to think. We are silenced, starved, and buried alive. If this letter reaches the world, let it be known silence is not consent. It is survival." She signed it with a trembling hand. Clara promised to hide the note inside a shipment of medical supplies sent to Leeds, hoping, praying that someone would find it. Whether the letter escaped the walls, Edith would never know, but writing it was enough. It reminded her she still existed, that she was still human. In early December, Edith overheard Dr. Halbridge boasting to Mr. Fenton about a new treatment, a crude form of electric shock he intended to test on her. "Her silence fascinates me," he said, smirking. "We'll see if the current can make her speak." When she heard those words, Edith felt a calmness descend upon her, not fear, not rage, but resolve. She had been caged for 2 years, beaten, frozen, silenced. They had taken her dignity, her family, and her name, but they had failed to take her will. In that moment, she knew the walls that had silenced hundreds would soon echo with something else: justice. From that day forward, Edith moved with quiet purpose. She began to collect small things, scraps of linen, bits of string, stray drops of lantern oil spilled from her cleaning duties. She memorized every exit, every door that stuck, every corridor where shadows hid her movements. She smiled politely at Dr. Halbridge when he passed, and he mistook it for surrender, but her silence had changed meaning once again. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence before the storm, the moment the air holds its breath before lightning strikes. Ravenscroft thought it had tamed her voice, but Edith had simply learned a new one, a voice made of patience, of planning, of flame, and one night soon, that voice would speak so loudly that even the heavens would hear. The walls of Ravenscroft still hummed with whispers and suffering. But among those echoes, one silence spoke louder than all the rest. Edith Winthrop's, the silence of a woman who had stopped waiting to be saved. Her silence was no longer submission, it was strategy, and soon it would be revolution. The winter of 1877 was the coldest anyone at Ravenscroft could remember. The wind howled through broken panes, turning every hallway into a tunnel of frost. The women huddled under threadbare blankets, shivering through nights that never seemed to end. But for Edith Winthrop, the cold no longer mattered. She had been waiting for this season, watching, measuring, remembering. Every detail of the asylum now lived inside her mind like blueprints drawn in silence. On the evening of February 13, 1877, Ravenscroft slept under a thick fog that rolled in from the moors. The air smelled of snow and something faintly metallic, as though the earth itself sensed what was coming. Edith sat on the narrow cot in her cell, hands folded neatly, listening to the rhythm of the asylum, the creak of the third-floor pipes, the slow footsteps of the night guard, the faint hiss of the gas lamps. Every sound had a place. Every minute had been counted. For weeks she had hidden scraps of oil, soaked linen beneath the floorboards of the laundry room. Clara had helped her, trembling but determined. "If we're caught," Clara whispered once, "they'll hang us." Edith's eyes were calm. "If we do nothing, they'll keep hanging women without a rope." Just before midnight, Dr. Halbridge appeared for his nightly inspection. His boots echoed on the tiles like gunshots. He stopped at Edith's door, peering in through the narrow slot. "Still mute, Miss Winthrop?" he asked, voice slick with mockery. She met his eyes without blinking. He smirked. "You know, silence is a disease too. Tomorrow we'll see if electricity can cure it." He turned away, his keys jangling as he disappeared into the corridor. When his footsteps faded, Edith exhaled for the first time that day. It was the last breath she would ever take as a prisoner. At 1 o'clock, the lamps dimmed. The asylum slept. Edith moved. Barefoot and silent, she slipped from her cell. The key she had stolen months earlier, lifted from a careless guard, fit perfectly into the lock. She crept to the next cell, turned it slowly, and opened the door to Eleanor, the frail widow who had begged not to disappear. Eleanor gasped. "What are you doing?" Edith pressed a finger to her lips. "Freedom," she whispered. The first word she had spoken in 2 years. They moved down the corridor, unlocking cell after cell. 2 women joined them, then 3, eyes wide, limbs trembling, but hope flickering like the first light of dawn. When they reached the laundry room, Clara was waiting, lantern in hand. Her face was pale but resolute. "Everything's ready," she murmured. "Are you sure?" Edith nodded. "The fire will speak for us." The plan was simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. Linen strips soaked in oil lined the wooden stairwell that connected the lower wards to the administrative wing. The lanterns, left burning by lazy guards, would do the rest. Edith crouched, struck a match, and for an instant the flame illuminated her face. Calm, determined, almost peaceful, she touched it to the linen. The oil caught instantly, spreading in a slow, hungry ripple of orange light. "Run when you see the light," she told the women. "Don't look back." Within moments, the first shouts echoed through the halls. A guard burst from his room, eyes wide with terror as smoke poured down from the ceiling. Fire! But the asylum was already turning into a furnace. The flames climbed the walls, devouring paint, wood, and time itself. The corridor glowed like dawn breaking inside a nightmare. Panic tore through Ravenscroft. Patients screamed. Guards scrambled for keys that were already melting in their hands. The matron fell trying to reach the water pump. Dr. Halbridge stumbled from his office, coughing, eyes red from smoke. "Get the records," he shouted to Mr. Fenton, who was already running the other way. "Save the files, you fool!" The fire answered for him. The ceiling above them cracked, raining sparks. Halbridge turned toward his private room, where he kept his ledgers and treatments. But the staircase had already become a river of flame. He tried to climb anyway, his coat catching fire halfway up. His screams joined the chorus of the damned. Mr. Fenton, choking on smoke, locked himself inside the records room to protect the asylum's secrets. The door handle glowed red. Within minutes, the smoke claimed him silently, and Reverend Cole, drunk from his nightly prayers, stumbled toward the chapel, clutching his Bible. He never reached the altar. The roof collapsed above him, burying both preacher and scripture in ash. 3 men who had ruled the asylum with cruelty met their judgment not by law, but by flame. Edith led the surviving women through the courtyard. Snow had begun to fall, smothering the world in ghostly white. The air outside was sharp and alive, the first real air she had breathed in 2 years. Behind them, Ravenscroft burned like a second sun. Flames roared through the windows, lighting the fog in gold and crimson. Clara stumbled beside her, coughing, tears streaking her suit, blackened cheeks. "We did it," she gasped. Edith shook her head. "No," we spoke. They reached the frozen field beyond the walls. Edith turned back one last time. The fire reflected in her eyes, not rage now, but release. She thought of the women who had died in silence, their names erased. She whispered their memory into the wind. "You're free now." At dawn, the authorities arrived to find Ravenscroft reduced to a smoking skeleton. Of more than 50 women, 23 survived, hacked, barefoot, huddled together in the frost. Among them was Edith, burned along one arm but standing tall. When questioned by constables, she said nothing. They demanded her name. She only looked toward the ruins. Clara spoke for her. "Her name is Edith Winthrop," she said, "and she was never mad." The newspapers called it the Ravenscroft Inferno. Some called it an accident. Others whispered of divine punishment. But in every retelling, one image remained: a silent woman standing before the flames, her eyes steady, her lips curved not in cruelty but in peace. In the weeks that followed, investigators uncovered ledgers, false death certificates, and evidence of horrific abuse. Ravenscroft's directors were disgraced. Laws governing mental institutions were reviewed. Yet Edith vanished soon after her hospital recovery. Some believe she died of her injuries. Others claimed Clara helped her flee to France under a new name. No one ever proved who struck the first match. But among the ashes, a melted nameplate was found from Dr. Halbridge's office. Etched beneath the suit were 3 words scratched in by hand: "Silence is power." The fire that destroyed Ravenscroft was not only vengeance, it was testimony. For the world outside, it was a tragedy. For the women within, it was deliverance. And for Edith Winthrop, it was the night her silence finally spoke. The fire at Ravenscroft Asylum burned for 2 days. When the last flames died, nothing remained but blackened walls and twisted iron. Snow fell over the ruins like a burial shroud, hissing where it touched embers. The world called it a tragedy, but for those who had lived behind those walls, it was resurrection. Edith Winthrop was found half-conscious in the frost-covered field beyond the asylum grounds. Her right arm was seared from shoulder to wrist, her hair singed, her lips cracked from smoke. She didn't resist when the constables lifted her into the cart. She didn't speak when they questioned her. To them, she was a mystery, the only inmate found standing amid the dead. To the newspapers, she became the silent patient of Ravenscroft. They took her to a local infirmary in Leeds, where the doctor wrote in his notes, "Patient is mute by choice. Eyes show no sign of madness, but of comprehension too sharp for comfort." While other survivors wept or raved, Edith lay still. She did not cry. She did not ask for freedom. She only watched the light change through the window bars, as though counting the hours of her own resurrection. When the constables returned to question her again, one of them, a younger man, nervous, asked gently, "Miss Winthrop, they say you set the fire. Is that true?" Edith turned her head slowly toward him. The silence stretched until he looked away. That was her answer. A week later, she was charged with arson and manslaughter for the deaths of Dr. Lawrence Halbridge, Mr. Fenton, and Reverend Cole. The irony did not escape her. They had declared her mad for speaking once. Now, they called her a murderer for staying silent. When she was escorted to the county jail, the people gathered to stare, some with horror, some with awe. "That's her," a woman whispered, "the one who burned the asylum." Another spat on the ground, "Monster." Yet another murmured, "Maybe an angel." Public opinion was split in two. Some saw her as a criminal, others as a victim of a system built to silence women. Her face, pale, expressionless, her eyes hauntingly calm, appeared in every paper. The headlines christened her the silent patient who spoke in fire. Her trial began in June of 1877, held in the Leeds Assize Court. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, journalists, reformists, and spectators drawn by equal parts fascination and fear. Edith sat at the defendant's bench, dressed in a plain gray gown. Her burn scars were still visible, but she held herself upright, unflinching. The prosecutor, Mr. Harold Bentham, painted her as a dangerous lunatic, a hysterical woman whose hatred for men had driven her to vengeance. She was placed in Ravenscroft for her own good, he thundered. And what did she do? She repaid care with carnage. But the defense, led by Mr. Jonathan Hale, a young lawyer known for his compassion, told another story. This woman was not mad, he argued. She was silenced. She endured cruelty beyond imagination. Ravenscroft was a place of torment, not treatment. The fire may have been her hand, but the guilt belongs to those who built that hell. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even the judge seemed unsettled. Over 3 long days, survivors of Ravenscroft were brought to testify. One by one, trembling women told their stories. They spoke of beatings, starvation, the hydrotherapy torture, and moral corrections in the chapel. A hush fell as Clara Milton took the stand. Her voice shook but did not falter. "Tacker." Halbridge planned to test electricity on her, she said, pointing toward Edith. He wanted to make her speak, but she had already said more in silence than any of us dared to in words. "Did she set the fire?" the prosecutor asked. Clara hesitated. "She freed us." The judge frowned. "That is not an answer, Miss Milton." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "Because freedom isn't always lawful, Your Honor. Sometimes it's necessary." Her words rippled through the room like wind through dry leaves. Outside the courtroom, the public was divided. The conservative papers called her a female arsonist, a warning of what happens when women are given too much freedom. The reformist journals, however, hailed her as a symbol of injustice, a living testament to the cruelty of the asylum system. Crowds gathered daily outside the court, holding placards. "Free Edith Winthrop! No more silent asylums!" Inside, Edith remained unmoved. She neither smiled nor wept. Her silence became her testimony, an act of defiance more eloquent than any speech. On the final day, the courtroom was silent as the judge addressed her directly. "Miss Winthrop," he said, peering over his spectacles, "the court has heard much on your behalf. Yet you have not spoken a single word in your defense. Will you continue this silence, even as your fate is decided?" For the first time in weeks, Edith lifted her head. Her gaze was steady, her voice quiet but unwavering as she answered, "If truth cannot live, then let lies burn." The room froze. It was as though time itself had stopped. The reporters scrambled to write it down, knowing they had just heard something immortal. The judge cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "You admit guilt?" Then, Edith did not answer. Her single sentence hung in the air like smoke, both confession and condemnation. On June 21, 1877, the verdict was read. Guilty of arson, legally insane at the time of the act. She was spared execution, condemned instead to indefinite confinement in the Wakefield Institution for the Criminally Insane. It was a quieter prison, less brutal than Ravenscroft, but a cage nonetheless. As she was led away, a young woman in the gallery called out, "You're not mad, Edith, you're free!" Others began to cheer softly, despite the guards' attempts to silence them. For the first time, a faint smile touched Edith's lips. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind the world she was still human. Within months of the trial, public outrage forced the government to open inquiries into asylum practices. Ravenscroft became the face of reform. The testimonies of its survivors were printed across England, sparking debates in Parliament. No one knows what became of Edith after her transfer. Some say she lived quietly, painting by her window in Wakefield until her death. Others believe Clara Milton helped her escape, slipping her across the channel under a false name. But her words, those 7 haunting words, were etched into history. Newspapers reprinted them for years. If truth cannot live, then let lies burn. To some it was a threat, to others a prayer. But to the women who had once been silenced behind cold walls, it was a promise that their voices, once buried, had finally been set free. The world forgot many of the names that perished in Ravenscroft, but not hers. Edith Winthrop, the woman who burned her prison, who refused to plead, who turned silence into rebellion, became both legend and warning. And though history tried to call her mad, the truth whispered louder: she was never insane. She was just the first to stop being afraid. When the trial of Edith Winthrop ended, it left England divided and haunted. Some called her a killer. Others whispered her name like a prayer. Months after her sentencing to the Wakefield Institution for the Criminally Insane, the newspapers moved on to new scandals and wars, but the echo of her words lingered in the public mind. If truth cannot live, then let lies burn. They were words that refused to die, like embers beneath ash, waiting for the wind. In the early years of her confinement at Wakefield, Edith was kept in a narrow cell overlooking a small courtyard. The guards said she never spoke, not even to the chaplain who begged her to confess. Yet she was not idle. She spent her days sketching. Birds, faces, flames, always flames. The doctors thought it a fixation, but one attendant, a young nurse named Margaret Allen, saw something else. She wasn't drawing fire. Margaret wrote in her journal later. She was drawing light. Margaret described her as calm, graceful, almost regal. When I entered her room, she wrote, I felt like standing before someone who had already seen the end of the world and survived it. Rumors spread among the staff. Some swore they heard her humming softly in the evenings, a melody without words. Others claimed that letters arrived for her from unknown senders, always sealed in wax, always burned after reading. Then, in the spring of 1881, Edith vanished. The night she disappeared, Wakefield was cloaked in fog so thick that the lamps glowed like ghosts. Her door was found unlocked at dawn. The bars on her window were intact. No footprints led from her cell. She was simply gone. The guards insisted she must have escaped during a shift change, but no one could explain how. Others whispered of help from within, that Nurse Margaret had smuggled her out dressed as a visitor. An investigation followed, but no evidence was ever found. Her name was removed from the registry, marked with a single word, missing. Some claimed she drowned herself in the River Calder. Others said she boarded a ship under another name and fled to France. A few believed she had burned herself alive in the moors, returning to the element that had freed her. But none could prove it, and that uncertainty gave birth to legend. By 1882, pamphlets began circulating in London under the title, The Silent Patient's Plea. They demanded reform in the nation's asylums and prisons for women. No one knew who wrote them, but each pamphlet bore a familiar symbol, a hand-drawn flame, and beneath it, the initials EW. Women began whispering her name in meetings, in factories, and even in Parliament galleries. She became a symbol of female endurance, a ghostly figure who had turned silence into rebellion. Newspapers that once condemned her began to reconsider. The Manchester Herald printed an article titled, The Woman Who Burned for Justice. Another wrote, If she was mad, then sanity is overrated. By the end of the decade, reform laws were passed requiring better conditions in asylums, and for the first time, female inspectors were appointed to oversee them. Many credited the movement to the fire that would not die. No one could say if Edith lived to see any of it, but her presence was felt in every act of courage that followed. In 1891, a letter surfaced in the archives of a small convent in Normandy. It was written in English, unsigned, and addressed to Sister Marianne. It read, I am alive, though I no longer live as I once did. I have seen the faces of the lost, and I have seen the faces of those who call them mad. Madness is not the fire. It is the cold that tries to put it out. Tell them I forgive no one, and yet I hate no one. Tell them only this silence is not absence. It is preparation. The handwriting matched old records from Ravenscroft. If it truly was Edith, she had survived, and was still speaking even in exile. As the 20th century approached, her story transformed from scandal to parable. Historians argued over her guilt. Psychologists cited her case as an example of trauma turned to resistance. Feminist writers called her the woman who spoke through fire. Paintings, novels, even stage plays began to appear. One famous portrait, displayed in the National Gallery, depicted her surrounded by smoke, her eyes half closed as if hearing something no one else could. Visitors often said the painting felt alive, that her gaze followed them as they walked past. What made Edith Winthrop's story endure was not the act of burning the asylum, but what it symbolized. She had lived in a world where women's words were treated as sickness, where silence was forced as punishment. Yet, she turned that silence into language, a language of defiance, a language that burned. Her fire became a mirror for the world, forcing it to see what it had done to its most vulnerable. Years after her disappearance, one of the Ravenscroft survivors, Clara Milton, was interviewed in London. She was an old woman by then, frail but sharp-eyed. When asked if she believed Edith was still alive, Clara smiled faintly. "She was never meant to live in this world," she said. "Women like her belong to history, or to heaven, and sometimes they make both burn a little brighter." Even as time passed, her name refused to fade. In 1903, when the Lunacy Act introduced new protections for patients, reformers placed a small plaque at the site of the old Ravenscroft grounds. It read, "In memory of Edith Winthrop, the silent patient who spoke through fire. She burned not for revenge, but for truth." Visitors still come there sometimes. Historians, poets, and wanderers, leaving candles among the grass. Some say, when the wind blows right, you can hear faint music rising from the ruins. A humming, wordless, soft, like the song of someone who no longer fears the dark. History often tries to silence those who speak too soon or too loud. But Edith Winthrop's voice never relied on sound. It lived in fire, in change, in the courage of those who followed. She proved that silence is not surrender. It can be strategy. She proved that madness can sometimes be clarity in disguise. And she proved that even a single woman, stripped of freedom and name, can still change the course of truth. They called her mad, criminal, ghost. But history remembers her differently, as the woman who spoke through fire and made the world listen.